I have a mirth moment. Only it's not a mirth moment. We shall laugh at it, I guarantee that. But actually, it's not at all funny. But I'll tell you about that afterwards. It's called the bricklayer's insurance claim. The following is an accident report that was printed in the newsletter of the Workers' Compensation Board. Dear Sir, I am writing in response to your request for additional information in space 3 of the accident report form. I put victim as the cause of my accident. You asked for a fuller explanation, and I trust the following details will be sufficient. I am a bricklayer. On the day of the accident, I was working alone on the roof of a new 6-story building. When I completed my work, I found I had some bricks left over, which, when weighed later, were found to be slightly in excess of 500 pounds. Rather than carry the bricks down by hand, I decided to lower them in a barrel by using a pulley which was attached to the side of the building at the 6th floor. Securing the rope at ground level, I went up to the roof, swung the barrel out, and loaded the bricks into it. Then I went down and untied the rope, holding it tightly to ensure a slow descent of the bricks. You will note in space 11 of the accident report that my weight is 135 pounds. Due to my surprise at being jerked off the ground so suddenly, I lost my presence of mind and forgot to let go of the rope. Needless to say, I proceeded at a rapid rate up the side of the building. In the vicinity of the 3rd floor, I met the barrel, which was now proceeding downward at an equally impressive speed. This explains the fractured skull, minor abrasions, and the broken collarbone, as listed in section 3 of the accident report form. Slowed only slightly, I continued my rapid ascent, not stopping until the fingers of my right hand were 2 knuckles deep in the pulley. Fortunately, by this time, I had regained my presence of mind, and I was able to hold tightly to the rope in spite of the excruciating pain I was now beginning to experience. At approximately the same time, however, the barrel of bricks hit the ground, and the bottom fell out of the barrel. And now, devoid of the weight of the bricks, the barrel weighed approximately 50 pounds. I refer you again to my weight. As you might imagine, I began a rapid descent down the side of the building. In the vicinity of the 3rd floor, I met the barrel coming up. This accounts for the 2 fractured ankles, broken tooth, and severe lacerations of my legs and lower body. Here my luck began to change slightly. The encounter with the barrel seemed to slow me enough to lessen my injuries when I fell into the pile of bricks, and fortunately only 3 vertebrae were cracked. I'm sorry to report, however, as I lay there on the pile of bricks in pain, unable to move, I again lost my composure and presence of mind and let go of the rope. I lay there watching the empty barrel begin its journey back down towards me. This explains the 2 broken legs. This also explains why I cited victim as the cause of my accident. See, I told you you'd laugh. It's a terrible misfortune. Why are we laughing? We sympathize with this poor Clute, but he brought it on himself. If anybody devised his own disaster, it was this guy. We know that, and it seems funny. But he's a victim of his own making. And we know, as a consequence of our involvement with life, that we too can be victims of our own making. We say sometimes, well, we've been victimized by circumstance. And that too can be true. Look at these tragic refugees who today are swarming out of the Middle East, out of Syria and elsewhere, trying desperately to find a new life. Did they bring this misfortune upon themselves? Are they the victims of their own devising? Some may be. My only wish is that among all those tens of thousands of young men, we could see a few families, children, and old people. But I suspect many of them have remained at home to become victims of circumstance. We can, however, overcome the tendencies toward victimization that all of us at some time or another experience. I want to read to you from Scripture from the Old Testament. I'm not a great lover of the Old Testament, so I don't often read from it. But there's a fantastic story in the Old Testament that I've enjoyed many times, and I'll abridge it. It's about Joseph. You remember Joseph, who was thrown into the pit? And this is in Genesis, 37th chapter. When Joseph came up to his brothers, and you remember they were jealous of him and hated him. When Joseph came up to his brothers, they stripped him of the long-sleeved robe which he was wearing, took him and threw him into the pit, and the pit was empty and had no water in it. And some Midianite merchants passed by and drew Joseph up out of the pit, the quintessential victim of circumstances, genuinely. They sold him for 20 pieces of silver to the Ishmaelites, and they brought Joseph to Egypt. And we say, good grief, there's the really classic victim, who did nothing to merit his victimization, yet found himself in the most appalling and depressing of situations. And yet, when we turn the page and go over to chapter 39, we read, Joseph lived in the house of his Egyptian master, who had bought him, of course. And the Egyptian master saw that the Lord was with Joseph and was giving him success and strength in all that he undertook. Thus Joseph found favor with his master and became his personal servant. Indeed, his master, a man called Potiphar, put him in charge of his household and entrusted him with all that he had. Now, we know, if we're familiar with the story, that there was a subsequent victimization of poor Joseph, from which he recovered equally well. This is the great Jewish success story. This boy had chutzpah. He will not let life get him down. He refuses to be life's victim. And yet, you know, so many people I meet, and myself included, we encounter victimization often as an expected part of our existence, of our lives. Why should that be so? Surely victimization has to be the anomaly in experience, does it not? The unusual event, not something we actually expect to occur within the compass of human experience. Why should we be victims? Why should we be? Part of the reason lies in the culture that we inhabit and the centuries of Christian doctrine which have tended to cast many people in a victim's role. Victims of God's wrath. God has punished us. Could never figure out why, when I was a little boy, God would have punished. There were plenty of things I deserved to be punished for, but I wasn't sure God was involved in any of that. Some of you may know the teachings of Jean Calvin. He was a French attorney. I won't hold that against him. But he lived in the 16th century, and he was part of the Reformation, what we call the Christian Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, which blossomed in Europe in that century with people like Luther. Calvin wrote in his Institutes of the Christian Religion, his massive work on theology, he said, God in the beginning knew whom he had damned and whom he had saved. Can you imagine writing a sentence of that sort? I mean, casting how much of humanity in the role of guiltless victims. And those who had been elected to survive, well, there was nothing they could do to earn their election. They were elected, and that was the end of it. This is called predestination, or predestinarianism in theology. And God forbid I should talk theology on a Sunday morning. I don't know where else I would talk it, but you see, this kind of thinking is in our cultural milieu, a lovely French word for it, in our cultural surroundings, the way we were born and brought up. Many of us were taught that somehow we were victims in some way, inscrutable way that we couldn't really understand. And so, quite naturally, under the laws of adaptation, many of us began to use the victim role to get something decent out of life. After all, perhaps the fundamental human desire is for. So why shouldn't we use our victim status to get some mileage? I've had a miserable and terrible life because I'm a victim, and there's nothing I can do about it. I haven't actually, but thanks largely to my beloved wife. No, I don't know. She's not going to say anything about this. No, seriously, we use the victim consciousness, or our understanding of our role as victim, very often because we feel we can't change it, to benefit ourselves in some way, to gain sympathy. How can you really blame me if I'm a victim? It wasn't my fault. Now, we're not all as stupid as the bricklayer. Some of us may be the Josephs who were cast into a pit and we didn't know why. But the point with Joseph is that he got out of the pit. He refused absolutely to be a victim, to allow anybody else to determine the quality of his life, his existence, and his expectations. And this is where it's so important for us to reject and to repudiate the idea that we are in any way victims. Yes, there may have been times when we felt ourselves victimized, when something unpleasant happened to us. But we've overcome it because we believe the power and the strength of Spirit are present in us and must necessarily express themselves in the life that we lead. We can triumph, we can overcome, we can go on. It doesn't necessarily have to be a grand and heroic effort, just a simple declaration that we can overcome this victimization notion. Some years ago, I met a Jewish man in Europe who had lost his entire family to what we call the Holocaust. Jews, many of them prefer to call it the Shoah, which in the Hebrew language means the misfortune, because the word Holocaust has unfortunate connotations for many Jewish people, for reasons that I'm not going to go into because they're theological too. But he lost his entire family. No man that I've ever met had more legitimate reason to consider himself a victim of the malice of others, of circumstances beyond his control than he. Extraordinary. And yet he said, I refused ever to acknowledge the role of victim, because if I had done so, those who persecuted me would have won. They would have extinguished my life, my prospects, my hopes, my desires, my wish to serve God. He became a rabbi. My wish to serve God. It's moving to meet somebody who has that degree of strength to overcome such an utter catastrophe. He could have spent the rest of his life claiming to be a victim and dining out on the experience, as they used to say. Poor man. He's the classic victim. We'll have him over to dinner, he can tell us. And we'll all say, gee, I'm glad I didn't have to go through that. None of us has to go through that if we keep the Spirit in mind and realize that the power and strength of God are in us. God needs us, as I said earlier, through whom to express. We're not pieces of clay. We're not automata. We're not robots. We are part of a huge creative experience. There's a purpose in our lives, and it has nothing to do with repression and being crushed and destroyed and victimized. So, go ahead, use the victim consciousness if you want to get some extra chicken soup. You might as well add another couple of days in bed to that flu recovery. Why not? But to let the victim consciousness become a part of our experience and to so express itself through us as to distort who and what we truly are as children of God is not only a tragedy, it's almost a blasphemy. My friends, none of us is a victim, and none of us needs to be, beyond the immediate circumstances that we sometimes encounter, because we have the power of resurrection. That's what I love about unity. We don't say resurrection happens just once. We say it happens every day, that we turn to the power of Spirit within us and affirm what we are as children of God. That is our resurrection from victimhood. And now I'll shut up and sit down.